Now we're going to look at how changes in the environment can affect an ecosystem. And we're going to look at two small examples as a way of looking at the kind of the broader picture. So we're going to look at a forest as an example of how changes in a terrestrial ecosystem can have an effect on things. But those same principles would apply whether you're talking about a grassland or even a desert. The same general principles still work. And for aquatic ecosystems, we're going to look at a lake and what some of the changes in a lake might do. But again, that would work for even a small stream or an ocean. The same general principles will apply. So keep that in mind as we're going through these examples. We're talking about one specific example, but they would apply to other situations as well. So when we talk about forests, the first thing you need to understand is some of the important roles that forests play in the environment. And one of the biggest ones is we've talked about with photosynthesis, that they recycle carbon dioxide in the environment, right? That photosynthesis, cellular respiration cycle. But they also cycle a lot of water. So a single tree, a really large tree, can absorb up to 5.5 tons of water from the soil and release it back into the atmosphere. Now, otherwise, that water may have run off on the surface, or it may have soaked down into the deeper parts of the water, deeper parts of the soil, so leaching away maybe some nutrients, or it could have run off, causing erosion or carrying nutrients away. If that tree hadn't been there, both of those processes would be happening faster. So having trees in the forest helps to control the runoff, holds the groundwater closer to the surface, and prevents the soil from washing away in that forest ecosystem. It also provides habitat for lots of different species, not just of plant, but of animals that use the forest for nesting sites or breeding sites, or maybe they just actually eat the trees themselves, or at least the other species that are growing in with the forest. So if we're disturbing the forest, we're disturbing all of this. It's not just about the trees, it's about the things that live there, it's about the groundwater, it's about the runoff. All of those things are going to be affected. So we're going to talk about 3 different types of deforestation that humans do, and some of the pros and cons of each one. You should be a little bit familiar with each of these. But also keeping in mind that we're not doing this in a judgmental way, that none of these are necessarily inherently good or bad, but each has some advantages and some disadvantages that have some implications for us. So the first one we're going to look at is what's called slash and burn. This one isn't very common around here. It's very common in tropical places. So places where people need to develop farmland to grow their crops and raise crops, either whether that's to sell to make money or whether that's food to provide for their family. In tropical countries, many places the soil there is not very good, and that seems odd because you're used to seeing tropical lush forests and things like that. But in reality, most of the nutrients in the ground are tied up in the living stuff, in the plants, in the rainforests, in all of that stuff. So the soil itself doesn't have a lot of nutrients. In fact, if something does die or fall off of a tree or something, it tends to decompose very rapidly, go back into the soil, and be reabsorbed. So the cycling of matter in a place like a rainforest or a tropical ecosystem is much faster than it would be, say, in southern Alberta. Because of that, when they cut down the forest to try to make farmland, the soil is very poor and it doesn't grow very much or grow very well at all. So one of the things they do to help put those nutrients back into the soil is to burn it. So they would slash it down, either put it in piles or just leave it on the ground and then burn it all off. And that ash acts like a natural fertilizer so that they can grow crops. So the advantage is it provides farmland, it provides food for some of these people. The disadvantage is it doesn't last very long. That ash nourishes the soil for a little while, but after a couple of years, that soil has been depleted of the nutrients when you make food and then sell it or eat it and send it away. Now the soil is poor again, and quite often that farmer then has to move on to the next piece of forest on his land and slash it down and burn it in order to keep growing crops. So without some other form of or other way of putting nutrients back into the soil, this kind of tends to be almost a vicious cycle where we just keep slashing and burning more and more and more forest every year. So that's slash and burn. Now the ones that are more common around here, clear cutting. If you've ever been up to the community pasture, you've probably seen clear cutting. Even on a drive along the Rocky Mountains, you've probably noticed patches like this. The advantage of clear cutting is it's relatively cheap and easy. We plot off a piece of land that we have access to for cutting, for logging, and then we go in and we just cut all of it. We don't have to worry about other things. We just strip it all off, take all the logs, and then we go. Now you can see even in this picture there's this patch right here, but there's a few other patches back there in the distance. And quite often when they do clear cutting, they don't clear cut an entire forest. They kind of do a patchwork so that there is still forest around it to provide, to keep some of that habitat around and things like that. So it's fast and efficient. Because it's fast and efficient, the lumber that we get from it tends to be cheaper. So if you're building a house or a shed or whatever you might be needing lumber for, that lumber is going to be a little less expensive from a clear cutting kind of operation. And in some cases it actually helps remove pests. Let's say that section of forest was infected with a pine beetle or something that was damaging the forest. Clear cutting can actually help either remove the pest or at the very least make these natural breaks where the pest that might be in this upper part of the forest is now going to have a harder time getting to this part of the forest because there's a break there where that pine beetle is going to have a harder time spreading from one section of forest to another. The disadvantages of clear cutting is this whole section has had almost all of its vegetation removed. And so now we talked about erosion. Now any water that falls on that part of the ground is going to run off. It's going to carry away some of the soil and the nutrients. More of that is going to end up in the groundwater, and that may change the rivers and the streams or the lakes that may be nearby. And even a really responsible clear cutting operation where they go back in and replant, you have to remember that if you were to go out into native forest, there's probably several different species of trees living in that forest. And quite often when we replant these forests, we don't replant all of those species. We replant maybe the one that we really want because we want to come back in the future and cut them down again, which means we went from maybe 5 species of trees and different plants down to 1. And so we've reduced the biodiversity in that area, which is going to have an impact. Even if we put in 2 or 3, it'll never quite be a full natural forest, or at least it'll take much longer for the natural species to spread back into this area, especially if we're returning and logging this area again. So that's clear cutting. In a clear-cut forest, it can take up to 60 years to go back, or even more in some cases, to go back to a completely fully developed forest. So if they've planted after clear-cutting new saplings or little trees, it's going to take quite a few years before that's a nice mature forest again like it was. So we're disturbing that piece of ecosystem for quite a large amount of time before that's ever going to be back again. So if we do clear cutting, we want to be responsible about not doing it too much, about picking areas where maybe it's less vulnerable to being disturbed, or where we can control some of the variables like species movement or erosion or things like that. Those are all factors that would go into good forestry kind of management. The last one is called selective cutting, and this is where rather than just go in and cut all the trees, they actually go in and only cut certain trees. They go in and decide which ones are ready for harvesting and which other trees to leave behind. The advantage of this is it preserves a lot of the habitat. You can see that this area is still shaded. There's still other trees to provide habitat, to provide food. And if anything, cutting down this tree may have opened things up to allow some of the smaller trees and other plants growing in the forest to thrive even more. So that's part of it. Another advantage of selective cutting is you're only harvesting the mature trees. You don't have to worry about maybe a smaller tree or something that's not really going to provide you the wood or the material that you're trying to get from the forest. And you can come back much sooner to a forest like this and reharvest. Let's say 10 years later, take the next group of trees out and plant a few more, or let it naturally replant, and this will just keep going. The cons of this is it's a very expensive process compared to being able to come in and just cut all the trees, load them on the truck, cut all the next trees, load them on the truck. You've got to have specialized equipment where you can work your way through the forest without disturbing the rest of the trees and removing the mature ones that you want. In some real expensive operations, usually used for things like hardwood or more expensive woods, they actually use helicopters. They'll go in and cut the tree down and helicopter the tree out to where it can be processed and loaded on the trucks and things like that. But that means that the wood we get from these kind of operations tends to be much more expensive, but and it's a lot slower of a process. You can't just go in and cut down 30 trees in an hour. You might only be cutting down 5 or 10. And so the costs are higher, which means that the cost of the wood is going to be higher for you to build your house or your shed or whatever it might be. So all of those play a factor into choosing when it's the right time to use clear cutting or whether we want to use more of a selective cutting kind of a process. All right. Another one is forest fires, and we're not just talking about human set forest fires, but although that is a problem, but even naturally occurring forest fires. Lightning causes forest fires all the time, and this is actually part of a really healthy process for most forests. If we go back and look, there's even records of Native American tribes setting forest fires in certain places to help naturally heal parts of the forest or to prevent the forest from encroaching on the land where maybe bison are grazing. So they were doing forestry management long before Europeans even got here. Now sometimes we see an image like this, and we'd think, oh, that's bad, right? Forest is being destroyed, we should prevent that. And so an example is in the Elk Island National Park. From 1906 to 1970s, if there ever was a forest fire that started, they very quickly tried to put it out, and they would send in people to deal with it to make sure it didn't spread. But there were some problems that came from that, and one of the problems was the fire itself is kind of a natural process, and in many cases it's good for the environment as long as it's not out of control. So we can actually, certain species of trees need fire to replant their seeds. Fire clears out some of the older mature trees and the dead growth that's sitting on the forest floor and allows new species of bush and flowers and things like that to grow and thrive in that new environment. It releases a lot of nutrients back into the soil from the forest. So there are some advantages to having fire. And they noticed this after the 1970s, that they were actually harming the ecosystem by not allowing at least some of these fires to burn. So they changed their policy, and they started to let some of the fires that were naturally set burned, and then they also started setting some prescribed burns. So areas that they could tell by looking at them and by doing some observations that they needed to have a fire, they would actually set the fire in that area. Now the challenge there is you have to be careful that the fire doesn't get out of control, and you don't want to do this near an area like Waterton, where there's humans involved, where there's structures involved, and we have to be more cautious. But even if you think back to the Waterton fire, some people think that the parks just let that fire burn because it was a naturally set fire. But no, because that park, of the way it's situated, basically funnels everything towards the town site. They were out trying to fight as much as they could that fire within an hour after the initial lightning strike. So they very aggressively were trying to fight that one, but the wind and the dry conditions just made it so they couldn't. Okay, that's basically it for forests. If you have any questions about anything that we talked about here, make sure you message me or send me an email, and we'll try to clear it up. If you're struggling with anything, let me know. Otherwise, in the next video, we're going to talk about similar kind of ideas, but how changes, whether they're human or naturally induced, will affect aquatic ecosystems, just like we talked here about the terrestrial.